welcome back, everyone. And today we are here for the final part of Reading Power of the Powerless, Part 7. It's been a challenging book to get through. It's just challenging, I think, to read and keep interesting because it's some heady stuff. But it's very relevant to what's happening today. I think it illustrates how history can repeat itself, how that's not a surprise. We are constantly battling with some of the same challenges politically, emotionally, spiritually, as human beings in society. But I think, I always would like to believe we can find better ways of dealing with those things so we can cohabitate in a more positive fashion. So that's why I chose to read that book. I think, of course, as I mentioned in Part 5, it's also somewhat valuable that the writer of the essay, Václav Havel, was later elected a president in Czechoslovakia. So I really do think his thoughts are valuable, very relevant to today. So on a bright side, I have a completely different book that I think is more fun planned for the next reading. And I'm also going to, after chewing on the concept of the Wednesday word, I believe I am ready to start that series. I'd also like to start having at least one show, if not weekly, every other week, where I bring someone on to interview. And I do have my first person picked out that I'm going to bring on to interview. She has a really interesting story. She weathered the last 3 years with her business as a healing center with massage and Reiki, things like that, and did not succumb to the many rules that they tried to force on the population. So it was quite the struggle, but she made it. And I think that will be a really good interview. So I look forward to doing that. My bigger point is that I do want to start having at least 2 episodes a week. It might take me a while to get there. I'm going to stagger that in the beginning between probably a bi-weekly Wednesday word to start, which will ultimately morph into a weekly Wednesday word as I continue to solidify my weekly goals and provide broader context for discussion in the future. So I hope that piques some interest. I'm looking forward to tying all of this together with a really broad paintbrush that pulls in a lot of different subject matter. It will not only be about the concept of state nationalism or sovereignty. It will also include other concepts such as frequency and how words are important and how they tie into not just the state national concept, but how we interact. And of course, how each of us has a different frequency, how frequency impacts the things around us. And that's why the next book that I read will be The Hidden Messages in Water, which, hang on, let me grab it. So if you haven't already heard of this book, it is quite a popular book. It's got some fun pictures in it too, which are important. The pictures supply valuable context for the subject matter itself and tie into sacred geometry, many different things of that nature. So I look forward to sharing that information with you, and hopefully that will help us generate more conversations that will drive future content. So I hope you enjoy, and please feel free to put your comments in. I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you. Chapter 19. I have already talked about the political potential of living within the truth and of the limitations upon predicting whether, how, and when a given expression of that life within the truth can lead to actual changes. I have also mentioned how irrelevant trying to calculate the risks in this regard are. For an essential feature of independent initiatives is that they are always, initially at least, an all or nothing gamble. Nevertheless, this outline of some of the work done by dissident movements would be incomplete without considering, if only very generally, some of the different ways this work might actually affect society. In other words, about the ways that responsibility to and for the whole might, without necessarily meaning that it must, be realized in practice. In the first place, it has to be emphasized that the whole sphere comprising the independent life of society, and even more so the dissident movement as such, is naturally far from being the only potential factor that might influence the history of countries living under the post-totalitarian system. The latent social crisis in such societies can, at any time, independently of these movements, provoke a wide variety of political changes. It may unsettle the power structure and induce or accelerate various hidden confrontations, resulting in personnel, conceptual, or at least climactic changes. It may significantly influence the general atmosphere of life, evoke unexpected and unforeseen social unrest and explosions of discontent. Power shifts at the center of the bloc can influence conditions in the different countries in various ways. Economic factors naturally have an important influence, as do broader trends of global civilization. An extremely important area, which could be a source of radical changes and political upsets, is represented by international politics, the policies adopted by the other superpower and all the other countries, the changing structure of international interests, and the positions taken by our bloc. Even the people who end up in the highest positions are not without significance, although, as I have already said, one ought not to overestimate the importance of leading personalities in the post-totalitarian system. There are many such influences and combinations of influence, and the eventual political impact of the dissident movement is thinkable only against this general background and in the context that background provides. The impact is only one of the many factors, and far from the most important one, that affect political developments, and it differs from the other factors, perhaps only in that its essential focus is reflecting upon that political development from the point of view of a defense of people and seeking an immediate application of that reflection. The primary purpose of the outward direction of those movements is always, as we have seen, to have an impact on society, not to affect the power structure, at least not directly and immediately. Independent initiatives address the hidden sphere. They demonstrate that living within the truth is a human and social alternative, and they struggle to expand the space available for that life. They help, even though it is, of course, indirect help, to raise that confidence of citizens. They shatter the world of appearances and unmask the real nature of power. They do not assume a messianic role. They are not a social avant-garde or elite that alone knows best, and whose task it is to raise the consciousness of the unconscious masses. That arrogant self-projection is, once again, intrinsic to an essential different way of thinking, the kind that feels it as a patent on some ideal project, and therefore that it has the right to impose it on society. Nor do they want to lead anyone. They leave it up to each individual to decide what he or she will or will not take from their experience and work. If official Czechoslovak propaganda described the Chartists as self-appointees, it was not in order to emphasize any real avant-garde ambitions on their part, but rather a natural expression of how the regime thinks, its tendency to judge others according to itself, since behind any expression of criticism, it automatically sees the desire to cast the mighty from their seats and rule in their places in the name of the people, the same pretext the regime itself has used for years. These movements, therefore, always affect the power structure as such indirectly, as a part of society as a whole, for they are primarily addressing the hidden spheres of society, since it is not a matter of confronting the regime on the level of actual power. I have already indicated one of the ways this can work. An awareness of the laws and the responsibility for seeing that they are upheld is indirectly strengthened. That, of course, is only a specific instance of a far broader influence, the indirect pressure felt from living within the truth. The pressure created by free thought, alternative values, and alternative behavior, and by independent social self-realization. The power structure, whether it wants to or not, must always react to this pressure to a certain extent. Its response, however, is always limited to two dimensions: repression and adaptation. Sometimes one dominates, sometimes the other. For example, the Polish Flying University came under increased persecution, and the flying teachers were detained by the police. At the same time, however, professors in existing official universities tried to enrich their own curricula with several subjects hitherto considered taboo, and this was a result of indirect pressure exerted by the Flying University. The motives for this adaptation may vary from the ideal. The hidden sphere has received the message, and conscience and the will to truth are awakened. To the purely utilitarian, the regime's instinct for survival compels it to notice the changing idea and the changing mental and social climate and react flexibly to them. Which of these motives happens to predominate in a given moment is not essential in terms of the final effect. Adaptation is the positive dimension of the regime's response, and it can, and usually does, have a wide spectrum of forms and phrases. Some circles may try to integrate values or people from the parallel world into the official structures to appropriate them, to become a little like them while trying to make them a little like themselves, and thus to adjust an obvious and untenable imbalance. In the 1960s, progressive communists began to discover certain unacknowledged cultural values and phenomena. This was a positive step, although not without its dangers, since the integrated or appropriated values lost something of their independence and originality, and having been given a cloak of officiality and conformity, their credibility was somewhat weakened. In a further phase, this adaptation can lead to various attempts on the part of the official structures to reform, both in terms of their ultimate goals and structurally. Such reforms are usually half measures. They are attempts to combine and realistically coordinate serving life and serving the post-totalitarian automatism, but they cannot be otherwise. They muddy what was originally a clear demarcation line between living within the truth and living with a lie. They cast a smokescreen over the situation, mystify society, and make it difficult for people to keep their bearings. This, of course, does not alter the fact that it is always essentially good when it happens because it opens out new spaces, but it does make it more difficult to distinguish between admissible and inadmissible compromises. Another and higher phase of adaptation is a process of internal differentiation that takes place in the official structures. These structures open themselves to more or less institutionalized forms of plurality because the real aims of life demand it. One example, without changing the centralized and institutional basis of cultural life, new publishing houses, group periodicals, artists' groups, parallel research institutes, and workplaces, and so on, may appear under pressure from below. Or another example, the single monolithic youth organization run by the state as a typical post-totalitarian transmission belt disintegrates under the pressure of real needs into a number of more or less independent organizations, such as the Union of University Students, the Union of Secondary School Students, the Organization of Working Youths, and so on. There is a direct relationship between this kind of differentiation, which allows initiatives from below to be felt, and the appearance of constitution of new structures which are already parallel or rather independent, but which at the same time are respected or at least tolerated in varying degrees by official institutions. These new institutions are more than just liberalized official structures adapted to the authentic needs of life. They are a direct expression of those needs, demanding a position in the context of what is already here. In other words, they are genuine expressions of the tendency of society to organize itself. In Czechoslovakia in 1968, the best-known organization of this type were KAN, the Club of Committed Non-Communists, and K231, an organization of former political prisoners. The ultimate phase of this process is the situation in which the official structures, as agencies of the post-totalitarian system, existing only to serve its automatism and constructed in the spirit of that role, simply begin withering away and dying off, to be replaced by new structures that have evolved from below and are put together in a fundamentally different way. Certainly, many other ways may be imagined in which the aims of life can bring about political transformations in the general organization of things and weaken on all levels the hold that techniques of manipulation have on society. Here, I have mentioned only the way in which the general organization of things was in fact changed as we experienced it ourselves in Czechoslovakia around 1968. It must be added that all these concrete instances were part of a specific historical process, which ought not be thought of as the only alternative, nor as necessarily repeatable, particularly not in our country. A fact which, of course, takes nothing away from the importance of the general lessons which are still sought and found in it to this day. While on the subject of 1968 in Czechoslovakia, it may be appropriate to point to some of the characteristic aspects of developments at that time. All the transformations, first in the general mood, then conceptually, and finally structurally, did not occur under pressure from the kind of parallel structures that are taking shape today. Such structures, which are sharply defined antithesis of the official structures, quite simply did not exist at that time, nor were there any dissidents in the present sense of the word. The changes that took place were simply a consequence of pressure of the most varied sort, some thoroughgoing, some partial. There were spontaneous attempts at freer forms of thinking, independent creation, and political articulation. There were long-term, spontaneous, and inconspicuous efforts to bring about the interpretation of the independent life of society with the existing structures, usually beginning with the quiet institutionalization of this life on and around the periphery of the official structures. In other words, it was a gradual process of social awakening, a kind of creeping process in which the hidden spheres gradually opened up. There is some truth in the official propaganda which talks about a creeping counter-revolution in Czechoslovakia, referring to how the aims of life proceed. The motive force behind this awakening did not have to come exclusively from the independent life of society, considered as a definable social milieu, although, of course, it did come from there, a fact that has yet to be fully appreciated. It could also have simply come from the fact that people in the official structures who more or less identified with the official ideology came up against reality as it really was, and as it gradually became clear to them through latent social crises and their own bitter experiences with the true nature and operations of power. I am thinking here mainly pardon my dog. Let us return to reading. I am thinking here mainly of the many anti-dogmatic reform communists who grew to become, over the years, a force inside the official structures. Neither the proper conditions nor the raison d'etre existed for those limited self-structuring independent initiatives familiar from the present era of dissident movements that stand so sharply outside the official structures and are unrecognized by them en bloc. At that time, the post-totalitarian system in Czechoslovakia had not yet petrified into the static, sterile, and stable forms that exist today. Forms that compel people to fall back on their own organizing capabilities. For many historical and social reasons, the regime in 1968 was more open. The power structure, exhausted by Stalinist despotism and helplessly groping about for painless reform, was inevitably rotting from within, quite incapable of offering any intelligent opposition to changes in the mood, to the way its younger members regarded things, and to the thousands of authentic expressions of life on the pre-political level that sprang up in that vast political terrain between the official and the unofficial. From the more general point of view, yet another typical circumstance appears to be important. The social ferment that came to a head in 1968 never, in terms of actual structural changes, went any further than the reform, the differentiation or the replacement of structures that were really only for secondary importance. It did not affect the very essence of the power structure in the post-totalitarian system, which is to say, its political model, the fundamental principle of social organization, not even the economic model in which all economic power is subordinated to political power. Nor were any essential structural changes made on the direct instruments of power, the army, the police, the judiciary, etc. On that level, the issue was never more than a change in the mood, the personnel, the political line, and, above all, changes in how the power was exercised. Everything else remains at the stage of discussion and planning. The two officially accepted programs that went furthest in this regard were the April 1968 Action Program of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia and the Proposal for Economic Reforms. The Action Program, it could not have been otherwise, was full of contradictions and halfway measures that left the physical aspects of power untouched. And the economic proposals, while they went a long way to accommodate the aims of life in the economic sphere, they accepted such notions as a plurality of interests and initiatives, dynamic incentives, restrictions upon the economic command system, left untouched the basic pillar of economic power, that is, the principle of state, rather than genuine social ownership of the means of production. So there is a gap here, which no social movement in the post-totalitarian system has ever been able to bridge, with the possible exception of those few days during the Hungarian uprising. What other development alternative might emerge in the future? Replying to that question would mean entering the realm of pure speculation. For the time being, it can be said that the latent social crisis in the system has always, and there is no reason to believe it will not continue to do so, resulted in a variety of political and social disturbances. Germany in 1953, Hungary, the USSR, and Poland in 1956, Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1968, and Poland in 1970 and 1976. All of them very different in their backgrounds, the course of their evolution, and their final consequences. If we look at the enormous complex of different factors that led to such disturbances, and at the possibility of predicting what accidental accumulation of events will cause that fermentation in the hidden sphere to break through to the light of day, the problem of the final straw, and if we consider how impossible it is to guess what the future holds, given such opposing trends as, on the one hand, the increasingly profound integration of the bloc and the expansion of power within it, And on the other hand, the prospects of the USSR disintegrating under pressure from awakening national consciousness in the non-Russian areas. In this regard, the Soviet Union cannot expect to remain forever free of the worldwide struggle for national liberation. Then we must see the haplessness of trying to make a long-range predictions. In any case, I do not believe that this type of speculation has any immediate significance for the dissident movements, since these movements, after all, do not develop from speculative thinking, and so to establish themselves on that basis would mean alienating themselves from the very source of their identity. As far as prospects for the dissident movements as such go, there seems to be very little likelihood that future developments will lead to a lasting coexistence of two isolated, mutually non-interacting, and mutually indifferent bodies, the main polis and parallel polis. As long as it remains what it is, the practice of living within the truth cannot fail to be a threat to the system. It is quite impossible to imagine it continuing to coexist with the practice of living within a lie without dramatic tension. The relationship of the post-totalitarian system, as long as it remains what it is, and the independent life of society, as long as it remains the locus of a renewed responsibility for the whole and to the whole, will always be one of either latent or open conflict. In this situation, there are only two possibilities. Either the post-totalitarian system will go on developing, that is, will be able to go on developing, thus inevitably coming closer to some dreadful Orwellian version of a world of absolute manipulation, while all the more articulate expressions of living within the truth are definitively snuffed out, or the independent life of society, the parallel polis, including the dissident movements, will slowly but surely become a social phenomenon of growing importance, taking a real part in the life of society with increasing clarity and influencing the general situation. Of course, this will always be only one of many factors influencing the situation, and it will operate rather in the background, in concert with the other factors, and in a way appropriate to the background. Whether it ought to focus on reforming the official structures or on encouraging differentiation or on replacing them with new structures, whether the intent is to ameliorate the system or, on the contrary, to tear it down. These and similar questions, insofar as they are not pseudo-problems, can be posed by the dissident movement only within the context of a particular situation, when the movement is faced with a concrete task. In other words, it must pose questions, as it were, ad hoc, out of a concrete consideration of the authentic needs of life. To reply to such questions abstractly and to formulate a political program in terms of some hypothetical future would mean, I believe, a return to the spirit and methods of traditional politics, and this would limit and alienate the work of dissent, where it is most intrinsically itself and has the most genuine prospects for the future. I have already emphasized several times that these dissident movements do not have their point of departure in the invention of systematic changes, but in a real everyday struggle for a better life here and now. The political and structural systems that life discovers for itself will clearly always be, for some time to come at least, limited halfway, unsatisfying, and polluted by debilitating tactics. It cannot be otherwise, and we must expect this and not be demoralized by it. It is of great importance that the main thing, the everyday, thankless, and never-ending struggle of human beings to live more freely, truthfully, and in quiet dignity, never imposes any limits on itself, never be half-hearted, inconsistent, never trap itself in political tactics, speculating on the outcome of its actions, or entertaining fantasies about the future. The purity of this struggle is the best guarantee of optimum results when it comes to actual interaction with the post-totalitarian structures. Chapter 20. The specific nature of post-totalitarian conditions, with their absence of a normal political life, and the fact that any far-reaching political change is utterly unforeseeable, has one positive aspect. It compels us to examine our situation in terms of its deeper coherence, and to consider our future in the context of global, long-range prospects of the world of which we are a part. The fact that the most intrinsic and fundamental confrontation between human beings and the system takes place at a level incomparably more profound than that of traditional politics would seem, at the same time, to determine as well the direction such considerations will take. Our attention, therefore, inevitably turns to the most essential matter, the crisis of contemporary technological society as a whole. The crisis that Heidegger describes as the ineptitude of humanity face to face with the planetary power of technology. Technology, that child of modern science, which in turn is a child of modern metaphysics, is out of humanity's control, has ceased to serve us, has enslaved us, and compelled us to participate in the preparation of our own destruction. And humanity can find no way out. We have no idea and no faith, and even less do we have a political conception to help us bring things back under human control. We look on helplessly as the coldly functioning machine we have created inevitably engulfs us, tearing us away from our natural affiliations, for instance, from our habitat in the widest sense of that word, including our habitat in the biosphere. Just as it removes us from the experience of being and casts us into the world of existences. This situation has already been described from many different angles, and many individuals and social groups have sought, often painfully, to find ways out of it, for instance, through Oriental thought or by forming communes. The only social, or rather political, attempt to do something about it that contains the necessary element of universality, responsibility to and for the whole, is the desperate, and given the turmoil the world is in, finding voice of the ecological movement. And even there, the attempt is limited to a particular notion of how to use technology to oppose the dictatorship of technology. Only a God can save us now, Heidegger says, and he emphasizes the necessity of a different way of thinking, that is, of a departure from what philosophy has been for centuries, and a radical change in the way in which humanity understands itself, the world, and its position in it. He knows no way out, and all he can recommend is preparing expectations. Various thinkers and movements feel that this as yet unknown way out might be most generally characterized as a broad existential revolution. I share this view, and I also share the opinion that a solution cannot be sought in some technological sleight of hand, that is, in some external proposal for change, or in a revolution that is merely philosophical, merely social, merely technological, or even merely political. These are all areas where the consequences of an existential revolution can and must be felt, but their most intrinsic locus can only be human existence in the profoundest sense of the word. It is only from the basis that it can become a generally ethical and, of course, ultimately a political reconstitution of society. What we call the consumer and industrial or post-industrial society, and Orshah E. Gasset once understood as the revolt of the masses, as well as the intellectual, moral, political, and social misery in the world today. All of this is perhaps merely an aspect of the deep crisis in which humanity, dragged helplessly along by the automatism of global technological civilization, finds itself. The post-totalitarian system is only one aspect, a particularly drastic aspect, and thus all the more revealing of its real origin, of this general inability of modern humanity to be the master of its own situation. The automatism of the post-totalitarian system is merely an extreme version of the global automatism of technological civilization. The human failure that it mirrors is only one variant of the general failure of modern humanity. The planetary challenge to the position of human beings in the world is, of course, also taking place in the Western world, the only difference being the social and political forms it takes. Heidegger refers expressly to a crisis of democracy. There is no real evidence that Western democracy, that is, democracy of the traditional parliamentary type, can offer solutions that are any more profound. It may even be said that the more room there is in the Western democracies compared to our world for the genuine aims of life, the better the crisis is hidden from people and the more deeply do they become immersed in it. It would appear that the traditional parliamentary democracies can offer no fundamental opposition to the automatism of technological civilization and the industrial consumer society, for they too are being dragged helplessly along by it. People are manipulated in ways that are infinitely more subtle and refined than the brutal methods used in the post-totalitarian societies. But this static complex of rigid, conceptually sloppy, and politically pragmatic mass political parties run by professional apparatuses and releasing the citizens from all forms of concrete and personal responsibility, and those complex fasci of capital accumulation engaged in secret manipulations and expansion, the omnipresent dictatorship of consumption, production, advertising, commerce, consumer culture, and all that flood of information, all of it, so often analyzed and described, can only with great difficulty be imagined as a source of humanity's rediscovery of itself. In his June 1978 Harvard lecture, Solzhenitsyn describes the illusory nature of freedoms not based on personal responsibility and the chronic inability of the traditional democracies as a result to oppose violence and totalitarianisms. In a democracy, human beings may enjoy many personal freedoms and securities that are unknown to us, but in the end, they do them no good, for they too are ultimately victims of the same automatism and are incapable of defending their concerns about their own identity or preventing their superficialization or transcending concerns about their own personal survival to become proud and responsible members of the polis, making a genuine contribution to the creation of its destiny. Because all our prospects for a significant change for the better are very long range indeed, we are obliged to take note of this deep crisis of traditional democracy. Certainly, if conditions were to be created for democracy in some countries in the Soviet bloc, although this is becoming increasingly improbable, it might be an appropriate transitional solution that would help to restore the devastated sense of civic awareness, to renew democratic discussion, to allow for the crystallization of an elementary political plurality, an essential expression of the aims of life. But to cling to the notion of traditional parliamentary democracy as one's political ideal, and to succumb to the illusion that only this tried and true form is capable of guaranteeing human beings enduring dignity and an independent role in society would, in my opinion, be at the very least short-sighted. I see a renewed focus of politics on real people as something far more profound than merely returning to the everyday mechanisms of Western, or if you like, bourgeois democracy. In 1968, I felt that our problem could be solved by forming an opposition party that would compete publicly for power with the Communist Party. I have long since come to realize, however, that it is just not that simple, and that no opposition party in and of itself, just as no new electoral laws in and of themselves could make society proof against some new form of violence, no dry organizational measures in themselves can provide that guarantee, and we would be hard-pressed to find in them that God who alone can save us. Chapter 21. And now I may properly be asked the question, what is to be done then? My skepticism towards alternative political models and the ability of systematic reforms or changes to redeem us does not, of course, mean that I am skeptical of political thought altogether. Nor does my emphasis on the importance of focusing concern on real human beings disqualify me from considering the possible structural consequences flowing from it. On the contrary, if A was said, then B should be said as well. Nevertheless, I will offer only a few very general remarks. Above all, an existential revolution should provide hope of a moral reconstitution of society, which means a radical renewal of relationship of human beings to what I have called the human order, which no political order can replace. A new experience of being, a renewed rootedness in the universe, a newly grasped sense of higher responsibility, a newfound interrelationship to other people and to the human community. These factors clearly indicate the direction in which we must go. And the political consequences? Most probably, they could be reflected in the constitution of structures that will derive from this new spirit, from human factors, rather than from a particular formalization of political relationships and guarantees. In other words, the issue is the rehabilitation of values like trust, openness, responsibility, solidarity, love. I believe in structures that are not aimed at the technical aspect of the execution of power, but at the significance of that execution in structures held together more by a commonly shared feeling of the importance of certain communities than by commonly shared expansionist ambitions directed outward. There can and must be structures that are open, dynamic, and small. Beyond a certain point, human ties like personal trust and personal responsibility cannot work. There must be structures that in principle place no limits on the genesis of different structures. Any accumulation of power whatsoever, one of the characteristics of automatism, should be profoundly alien to it. They would be structures not in the same sense of organizations or institutions, but like a community. Their authority certainly cannot be based on long, empty traditions, like the tradition of mass political parties, but rather on how, in concrete terms, they enter into a given situation, rather than a strategic agglomeration of formalized organizations. It is better to have organizations springing up ad hoc, infused with enthusiasm for a particular purpose, and disappearing when that purpose has been achieved. The leaders' authority ought to derive from their personalities and be personally tested in their particular surroundings, and not from their position in any nomenclature. They should enjoy great personal confidence and even great lawmaking powers based on that confidence. This would appear to be the only way out of the classical impotence of traditional democratic organizations, which frequently seem founded more on mistrust than mutual confidence, and more on collective irresponsibility than on responsibility. It is only with the full existential backing of every member of the community that a permanent bulwark against creeping totalitarianism can be established. These structures should naturally arise from below, as a consequence of authentic social self-organization. They should derive vital energy from a living dialogue with the genuine needs from which they arise, and when these needs are gone, the structures should also disappear. The principles of their internal organization should be very diverse, with a minimum of external regulation. The decisive criterion of this self-constitution should be the structure's actual significance, and not just a mere abstract norm. Both political and economic life ought to be founded on the varied and versatile cooperation of such dynamically appearing and disappearing organizations. As far as the economic life of society goes, I believe in the principle of self-management, which is probably the only way of achieving what all the theorists of socialism have dreamed about. That is, the genuine, i.e., informal, participation of workers in economic decision-making, leading to a feeling of genuine responsibility for their collective work. The principles of control and discipline ought to be abandoned in favor of self-control and self-discipline. As is perhaps clear from even so general an outline, the systematic consequences of an existential revolution of this type goes significantly beyond the framework of classical parliamentary democracy. Having introduced the term of post-totalitarian for the purpose of this discussion, perhaps I should refer to the notion I have just outlined, purely for the moment, as the prospects for a post-democratic system. Undoubtedly, this notion could be developed further, but I think it would be a foolish undertaking, to say the least, because slowly but surely the whole idea would become alienated, separated from itself. After all, the essence of such a post-democracy is also that it can only develop via facti, as a process deriving directly from life, from a new atmosphere and a new spirit. Political thought, of course, would play a role here, though not as a director, merely as a guide. It would be presumptuous, however, to try to foresee the structural expressions of this new spirit without the spirit actually being present and without knowing its concrete physiognomy. Pardon me. Chapter 22. I would probably have omitted the entire preceding section as a more suitable subject for private meditation were it not for a certain recurring sensation. It may seem rather presumptuous, and therefore I will present it as a question. Does not this version of post-democratic structures in some way remind one of the dissident groups or some of the independent citizens' initiatives as we already know them from our own surroundings? Do not these small communities, bound together by thousands of shared tribulations, give rise to some of those special, humanly meaningful political relationships and ties that we have been talking about? Are not these communities, and they are communities more than organizations, motivated mainly by a common belief in the profound significance of what they are doing, since they have no chance of direct external success, joined together by precisely the kind of atmosphere in which the formalized and ritualized ties common in the official structures are supplanted by a living sense of solidarity and fraternity? Do not these post-democratic relationships of immediate personal trust and the informal rights of individuals based on them come out of the background of all those commonly shared difficulties? Do not these groups emerge, live, and disappear under pressure from a concrete and authentic needs, unburdened by the ballast of hollow traditions? Is not their attempt to create an articulate form of living within the truth and to renew the feeling of higher responsibility in an apathetic society really a sign of some kind of rudimentary moral reconstitution? In other words, Are not these informal, non-bureaucratic, dynamic, and open communities that comprise the parallel polis a kind of rudimentary prefiguration, a symbolic model of those more meaningful post-democratic political structures that might become the foundation of a better society? I know from thousands of personal experiences how the mere circumstance of having signed Charter 77 has immediately created a deeper and more open relationship and evoked sudden and powerful feelings of genuine community among people who were all but strangers before. This kind of thing happens only rarely, if at all, even among people who have worked together for long periods in some apathetic official structure. It is as though the mere awareness and acceptance of a common task and a shared experience were enough to transform people in the climate of their lives, as though it gave their public work a more human dimension that is seldom found elsewhere. Perhaps all this is only the consequence of a common threat. Perhaps the moment the threat ends or eases, the mood it helped create will begin to dissipate as well. The aim of those who threaten us, however, is precisely the opposite. Again and again, one is shocked by the energy they devote to contaminating in various despicable ways all the human relationships inside the threatened community. Yet, even if that were so, it would change nothing in the question I have posed. We do not know the way out of the marasmus of the world, and it would be an expression of unforgivable pride were we to see the little we do as fundamental solution, or were we to present ourselves, our community, and our solutions to vital problems as the only thing worth doing. Even so, I think that given all these preceding thoughts on post-totalitarian conditions, and given the circumstances and the inner constitution of the developing efforts to defend human beings and their identity in such conditions, the questions I have posed are appropriate. If nothing else, they are invitation to reflect concretely on our own experience and to give some thought to whether certain elements of that experience do not, without our reality being aware of it, point somewhere further beyond their apparent limits, and whether right here in our everyday lives, certain challenges are not already encoded, quietly waiting for the moment when they will be read and grasped. For the real question is whether the brighter future is really always so distant. What if, on the contrary, it has been here for a long time already, and only our own blindness and weakness have prevented us from seeing it around us and within us and kept us from developing it? And that concludes part 7. With chapter 22, which is the last chapter in the book. And if you have listened to all of these episodes, or all of these readings, I want to thank you. I hope that you've enjoyed it. It certainly wasn't an easy book to read, but I think it was very valuable. See you next time.